So yeah, our speaker today is Doug Braun. Doug did his PhD at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. After his PhD, he was an assistant astronomer at the Institute for Astronomy at the University of Hawaii. He then held an astronomer position with the Solar Physics Research Corporation, and he moved to Northwest Research Associates in 2000. He joined the NWRA Board of Directors in 2009 and has been a vice president there since 2010. Doug's research interests include helioseismology and solar physics, and Doug, together with Charlie Lindsay, has been a pioneer of helioseismicalography. And one of the highlights was in 2000, they showed that holography could be used to detect solar active regions on the far side of the sun. And I also wanted to add, on a personal note, that Doug and I, we worked together for many years at NWRA, and at least from my point of view, it was a really enjoyable and productive collaboration, and I learned a lot from Doug during that time. I'm really happy to have you here, Doug, to give a talk.
Thank you. Those are very, very nice words, and thanks for inviting me. I did have a chance to look at some of the prior talks, and they're a tough act to follow. Okay, sorry, for some reason I can't share the screen for unknown reasons, so I can't move my cursor around. I will try to be descriptive as to where you should be looking at. So let's just go to the next slide. So this is a brief outline, and after a brief history, the next three items I will pretty much just describe technical aspects of the analysis, and then get to the results, which are the average flow maps. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the reliability of those maps. I think if any advice I could give young scientists would be, spend a lot of time looking for systematic errors and things. It isn't a question of whether they'll be there; it's just a question of how big they'll be. And then I'll wrap up with a summary. So next slide. So history and motivation. Next. All right. The inflows into active regions, and I think you've seen at least the figure on the left in a prior talk I noticed. But these were an early repeatable result in local helioseismology, and by repeatable I mean multiple methods were more or less coming up with the same kind of thing. On the left, you see some very early results by Laurent with kind of a method that used F modes, and it's he used a calibration procedure that is significant for this talk because I'll be doing a similar thing. On the right are actually the results of inversions of ring diagram frequency splittings that Deborah Haber made, and the top shows a kind of a near surface day-to-day variation of these large-scale inflows, and the bottom shows the sort of inversion results at 14 megameters, which appears to show that the inflows turn into outflows. So you have sort of a toroidal-like flow structure there. But these were seen by a number of different techniques, and if I could have the next slide. It turns out they tend to show up in a lot of different places and different physics problems, and so it's worth studying. One reason, of course, is just to understand the physics behind them. I think it was Hank Sprout who first suggested quite a few years ago now that the rate of losses in magnetic fields could drive a geostrophic-like flow or wind, much like a low pressure system in the Earth's atmosphere. And these flows would also have a cyclic component as well as the diverging component, that will come up as we'll see. Another reason for studying flows was very popular about 10 years ago or so. The idea came out that maybe you could use these to predict solar flares, that the motions around active regions help to stir up the magnetic fields and perhaps twist them into a configuration that reconnection or other kinds of events could happen. The next two bullets are kind of related. The flows are also thought to sort of mirror, flows around individual active regions seem to mirror the kind of large-scale global flows we see, or particularly the residuals of those flows after the mean has been subtracted. So things like the meridional flow is a very important input to flux transport models, for example. And if you look at the time variation of the meridional flow, it takes the form of this convergence towards the active region bands, and this kind of mirrors these inflows that we see in individual active regions. So the question naturally comes up: is what we're seeing in these longitudinal average measurements just the contribution of the active regions, or is there something like a quiet sun component to them? So that's been a long-standing question. And the final reason for maybe studying these flows is what kind of came as a surprise to me. It's this last bullet down here. It turns out that I included, I know there are members of the Plato team here listening. So the next big thing in exoplanets is to find Earth-sized planets in habitable zones. And there's lots of different ways to do this. And one way is to just take large ground-based telescopes and do very high precision radial velocity measurements. And we're talking like centimeter per second kind of precision. So once you have an instrument capable of measuring that, you then have the very daunting modeling task of extracting an orbital perturbation from a vast ocean of Doppler signals on the surface of the star that you have to understand and model out. And one of those flows, of course, are these active region flows. And kind of 2 years after, or 2 years ago when I wrote my first paper, very soon after I got contacted by Steve Sarr, who's at Center for Astrophysics, and he's leading a team to actually look at this problem. And he saw my maps. He said, "This is exactly what I need. Can you join our team and help us out?" And so stay tuned for stuff on that. If I could have the next slide. So some prior work. And as usual, there's just not enough time to talk about all the important work that's predated this. I would be amiss to not mention the vast number of papers that Rudy Kamm and his colleagues have produced over the years, mostly looking at results of ring diagrams, so relatively low resolution, but nevertheless finding lots of very interesting large-scale associations between magnetism and flows, and that go back for many years. In terms of looking specifically at active regions and specifically at high resolution so that you can resolve the flows a little bit better, there hasn't been a whole lot. Brad Heinemann, who I notice is in the audience here, I think did a very nice job 2009 with looking at a new technique or improving ring diagram to the point where you could do very high resolution flow measurements with it. And he looked at something like 600 samples of 100 active regions. And one of the, he's responsible for this kind of cartoon figure on the right there. And that gives kind of an overview of what we think we know about active region flows, at least schematically. Namely that we have sunspots with strong mote flows and apparently anticyclonic motion associated with those. But those sunspot flows are surrounded by the larger plage area, for example, and there are these inflows that are associated with them. And Brad was, I think, the first to maybe notice the cyclonic motions around the peripheries of these regions. And I kind of got into this business maybe a little bit late in the game, but nonetheless, I think have some interesting results to present here. And finally, I just want to point out that there are non-helioseismic analyses of these flows as well. Bjorn Luptin did a very nice job a couple of years ago looking at basically local correlation tracking methods applied to, I think, something like the 250 largest active regions, and he employed the same kind of ensemble averaging to get an average flow map that I did. So well, maybe we can. There's some interesting similarities and differences that maybe we can get into. If I could have the next slide. So yes, ensemble averaging. So really the idea here is that if you just do a flow map using something like holography or time distance, and you do it at relatively high resolution, you get a map that looks like this for an active region. And it's very nice. You see the mode flows, the outflows coming from the spot. But you also see really a very strong supergranulation field contributing to all the flows outside of it. And these have amplitudes up to several hundred meters per second. And some of the flows that we're looking at are more like in the tens of meters per second. So really to see that, you really have to do some kind of averaging. And so almost every figure that you've seen showing inflows around sunspots has been averaged in some way, either with those large 15-degree ring diagram tiles or some other kind of averaging. And the idea with ensemble averaging is to sort of maintain the resolution, but beat down the noise or the supergranulation signal in this case by finding lots and lots of similar looking active regions and then adding them together, co-aligning them and adding the measurements together, if you will. And this kind of procedure has been done for other things on the sun, supergranulation, for example. I think there's some other small magnetic elements and things like that have been averaged together in this way. And you can choose these averages to look at various parameters. And mostly what I'll be talking about here is magnetic flux. But another thing I'm interested in doing is to try to pick active regions at similar stages of evolution, so as to see the evolution of these flows. So if I could have the next slide. And we use a procedure that basically avoids inversions, and probably you've heard lectures about how daunting that task is, and it is quite a daunting one. So folks like us try to avoid it as much as possible. So what I do is a simple sort of a calibration procedure, and this works if, for example, you're only really interested in sort of the near surface flows, for example, and you're not really trying to extract some very subtle subsurface flow from a large surface signal. But if you assume that you're looking at the size of a flow that's much larger than the, say, sensitivity function that it relates the flow to the actual measurement, then you can kind of just bypass the inversion entirely and just say that the flow is proportional to the travel time measurement, in this case, say at east minus west and north minus south. I should have started from the beginning by pointing out that I'm using holography. Aaron did make the point that that's what I use. For practical purposes, what you need to know about holography is that if you set it up in a certain way, it will basically give you measurements that are indistinguishable from time distance measurements, and perhaps that's the best way of thinking about this for the purpose of this talk. But so you have these same kind of east minus west, north minus south measurements that are proportional to the flow components in those directions, and you can come up with the calibration constant by basically doing sort of tracking experiments where normally you follow an active region, you're gonna at least follow Carrington rotation or some small variation. So you do one measurement do tracking at Carrington, and then you do another measurement, but you add an offset advection to the image frame, something like 200 meters per second, and then you look at the difference in the signatures between those two maps, and you can see that, calibrate that 200 meters per second flow. So for this particular work, the flow, the focus depth here that I use in these kinds of measurements may seem relatively deep, 3 megameters, but if you actually look at the sensitivity function that's shown in as kind of that reddish, yellow, blue, red image on the bottom there, that there's actually, yes, there's a strong contribution at that depth, but an even larger contribution at the surface. And so that's what we're primarily sensitive to. And the other assumption is that the flows are primarily horizontal, or that's what's dominating the signal, which is for shallow flows, it's probably reasonable. Next slide. Okay, so yeah, I'll be talking about the sample that I pick and how we select it. So next slide. Thanks. So this sort of shows the sample that I currently have, and it's sort of color coded to represent the brief history of it. About 5 or 6 years ago, I was interested in looking at this flare business. Are there signatures we can see that may act as precursors to solar flares? So I did a holography survey of flow maps for something like I think it was about 3,000 measurements of about 200 or 300 of the largest NOAA catalog of active regions. They use sunspot area to determine whether it goes into the catalog or not. And these pretty much picked the third largest. So those are these red points. And this is a scatter plot showing all the measurements I have as a function of time and a function of flux on the vertical axis. Okay, so these are the red points are relatively high flux regions. Getting a negative result from that project, I then tried to figure out what I could do to make use of the data further, and I decided to expand the survey primarily by picking much lower flux regions, and I did so over 6 Carrington rotations. So those are these green points that sort of appear every 10th Carrington rotation there. And those formed the basis of the paper that I wrote 2 years ago that showed basically the first ensemble averages of the active region flows. In the preceding 2 years or so, I've extended it further with funding from Living with a Star project, and I've gone both out further in time, capturing the full 11-year HMI duration. Of course, the last couple of years, we haven't had too many large active regions, so the curves are falling down. And I've gone even weaker regions than the 2019 paper. And so really what I'll be showing today is kind of an update of that result. So most of the figures are new. They've been updated since then. So if I could have the next slide. Thanks. So a little bit about how the regions are selected, and this is meant not to be complete. It's meant to be representative. The idea trying to find active regions that are relatively isolated, that you can measure flows, and it has something that would have a meaningful area, regions of quiet sun around it, and so forth. We'll see that's sort of important. But basically what you do is you just take a synoptic magnetogram like you see at the top, and you take the absolute value and then you smear it, and then you get sort of what's on the bottom. And then it just becomes, finding the peaks of those blobs. and you can have criteria such as if two blobs appear too close together, then you can reject the smaller of the two, for example, to sort of not look at these little peripheral things. And we can then measure the flux in the bounding box that are drawn there, and then you can impose a cutoff. And this is what I've been spending some time determining: how small of an active region produces a measurable flow, or, for example, is one of the things that I've been looking at. And it turns out that you if you go down to 3 times 10 to the 20 Maxwell, that seems to be about the limit that I've found. If you go much lower than this, you're in the sort of what are called ephemeral region and range, and these little things have lifetimes that are just not very long. You can't really do helioseismology on them too easily, for example. They don't last long enough. So there's a sort of a practical limit here to that. So, all right, if I could have the next slide. So this table on the right then summarizes what I've got to date. And again, it's sort of an update of the 2019 paper. This new group W consists of these smaller regions that fall below my prior cutoff. So I apologize for the weird naming scheme. I wasn't thinking ahead when I named the other ones A through E, I guess. But so they currently, the sample consists of about 6,800 maps from almost 500 unique regions. And the point is you can follow regions for multiple days and do multiple measurements on, and that's what's done. So essentially 16 maps over a 9-day period. And as the active regions evolve, then they would get assigned to different flux categories according to their current status. So if I could have the next slide. Thank you. So this shows just some magnetic properties of them. The top row here show just a random sample, and I really did program this figure to select from my catalog randomly. So you see examples of each group here on the top, and then on the bottom is if you take those magnetograms and do this ensemble averaging. And there's a couple of things first that you have to sort of define a coordinate system here and specify how you treat the north versus the south. So really what we have is the x coordinate is a westward coordinate at all times. The y is like a latitude, but it always points towards the poles. So that means that any maps of regions in the south will be flipped top to bottom. And to preserve the polarity here, the reason it comes out to a nice bipolar looking region here is because I've flipped the sign of the magnetograms in the south before doing this averaging. Okay, so it's always amazing to me to see this, that how you take really random looking active regions and they average so nicely out. This first group all the way on the left, this group W here that I've looked at lately, you don't at this, the scale of the averages is set to the same grayscale, but you can't really see anything unless you really crank up the contrast for that one. So that's what's shown down there. And yes, indeed, there actually does seem to be an average signal there. If you go much lower than this cutoff, you tend to pretty much see nothing. So, okay, I think that makes the point. All right, next slide. Okay, so, we're interested in the contribution of or the flows that are associated with the active region. and we need to define a reference frame for that. And essentially that reference frame is the nearby quiet sun. So how do we set that frame is by, we have what is shown on the right here are the grayscale images show basically images of the individual components, flow components. So the top are the, V in the X direction, or the kind of zonal direction if you want, and Y or meridional direction is that shows the other component. And you see these sort of large scale gradients across that. In the case of Vx, that's a result of the differential rotation. I should say these are tracked at a Carrington rate, but you still see the residual rotation. And that's a large signal, and we measure it in these quiet sun strips to the left and the right that I think you can see in the upper left frame there, those thin white lines, hopefully. Those are where we determine the reference flows. And then the middle sort of line plot shows the average versus latitude for, or Y direction, I should say, for of those Vx and Vy, the averages over those strips. And then a polynomial is fit and subtracted out. And so you have the corrected versions on the right. Okay, if I'm going to have the next slide. Okay, the next slide as well. So we start to see the ensemble averages now. And at the top, I listed the flux range of each group as well as the median flux. And I do realize that sometimes flow maps can be hard to see and get kind of cluttered really fast. So I'll try to point things out. Could be challenged without the mouse here, but the point is that you tend to see these inflows appearing quite quickly and at even very low flux regions. You're a little bit hard pressed to see any real flows at the very, in group W at the very on the left side there. But if you do look closely, there are some inflows. They become much more prominent here in the middle panel, and I think are noticeably stronger again in group B on the right. What is also very interesting and perhaps relevant to the idea of there are some cyclonic motions associated with these active regions are this. If you look, say, in the map on the far right, group B, and you look above sort of the poleward side of the magnetic flux there that's shown as the blue and white, the blue and yellow, you see that the inward, the vectors are kind of slanted to the left, which means that not only are you have an inflow, but you have sort of a retrograde or eastward component that's associated with that inflow. And if we go to the larger flux groups, which is the next slide, thank you. We see that kind of that slanting motion or that retrograde component becoming very prominent. But what's also interesting, if you look on the equatorward side now, or look at below the magnetic flux there, you start to see, particularly at the stronger regions, you see another retrograde component coming in there and getting stronger with flux until you get to the largest, where it's almost symmetric. You have this component on both sides. So that's kind of interesting and, to be honest, unexpected. One thing I just want to say about these maps is that I've sort of suppressed the strong signals that you see in the sunspots. There are these mote flows, of course, and in these averages, the sunspots don't all align right, but you just generally get this sort of large blob of strong outflow there, and it's very distracting. So it's been suppressed. If you go to my paper from a few years ago, you can see both flows with and without the sunspots shown to get an idea of what that looks like. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So this gets into this point I made earlier about, what's the difference between active region flows and what we see in some of these longitudinal and time averages of the flows. And as I said, that's been sort of a long-standing question. Occam's razor might suggest, well, maybe that's just it. Maybe it's just individual active regions, and that's all we're seeing when we do these averages. It's probably not the case, though, because we do know that periods of low solar activity, we still see changes in some of these large-scale flows. So it probably, why is it go back? And but to get an idea of how important these flows are for these averages, I did sort of really, I wouldn't say this is more than a back of envelope kind of calculation. It's not, the final word on this. It was really meant to just estimate, is it something like 1/10 of the signal? Is it comparable? Is it more? What's going on? So what I did was to sort of assume, again, just take a synoptic magnetogram, assume that is representative of the active regions that were present during that rotation. All right, now they're really coming and going during that time. It's not a snapshot. It's an evolving magnetic structures, or so it's not quite true, but nevertheless is representative. So we can take our high signal to noise flow maps and project them on a Carrington map, and based on the appropriate flux classification, and just substitute the average map there, and then do a longitudinal average as if that was the real sun you were measuring, and see what kind of residuals you see. And the idea being that, if, again, remember that the reference frame of these flows are with respect to nearby quiet sun. So if there was patterns in the sun that occur at all longitudes, okay, they're axisymmetric and occur whether there's an active region there or not, then basically this map should be zero, or these residuals should be zero, because everything is relative to the quiet sun. So what you're seeing on this plot in the lower right is really the extra contribution that active regions would provide if to the existing quiet sun flows that are present. And you see, interestingly enough, that you do see sort of the signals that come out to about plus or minus 2 meters per second. And they even have an appearance, we see, like in the upper frame, the meridional component, we see this kind of modulation representative of converging flows towards these dotted lines that sort of tell you where the peak activity is in latitude. And I think that's been sort of known for a while. What was surprising, though, for me was that this retrograde component that I've seen seems to add up to a very interesting signal in the zonal flow as well. And again, on the order of about 2 meters a second or so. And again, because of this asymmetry between they tend to primarily occur at the northern side, except for the very largest regions, which are relatively rare. So in general, you see this asymmetry sort of prevail, and you see a retrograde feature in the zonal residual that's on the order of 2 meters per second, and lies just below or above the active latitude, below in the south and above in the north. And again, it's around 2 meters per second. And the plot here on the left is another figure from one of Rudy's many papers where he's actually looked at sort of these residuals of large-scale flows. And I think the one on the bottom, you've probably seen other examples. Rachel, I'm sure, has shown nice plots of the torsional oscillation. That's basically what this is showing. What's kind of interesting is you can do a similar plot for the meridional flow, and that's what's shown on the top. And they both show these kind of perturbations around the active latitudes that seem to be in the same ballpark. Again, the scale there for those plots is like 10 plus or minus 10 meters per second. And I think if you go in and actually look at the amplitude of those features, they're about 2 or 3 meters a second. So it seems like, you probably shouldn't be ignoring these when you're considering these averages. So, but this is kind of a very crude estimate again, and there's a lot of things about this analysis that I think should be improved, and so I'm looking into ways of doing that, and so that's kind of a future project, though. Next slide. Yeah. So here we get into some of the reliability issues, and I think one of the biggest important tools in helioseismology over the last decade or so has been the availability of very nice artificial data, and that you can test methods with, and some of this data comes in the way of very complicated MHD simulations. I'm sure you've seen some of the work of Matthias Rempel highlighted recently, and these are examples of basically artificial data that I've helped Matthias over the years to provide to the helioseismic community. And we were continuing to do that. We have some quiet sun boxes that contain convective flows and small scale dynamos. So there are magnetic fields there and things that look remarkably like supergranules to test. On the right, we see one of his amazing sunspot simulations, and we've tested and looked at a lot of these over the years, and so these are really, really very useful. I put the link down in the lower left corner there where this data is available for anyone who wants to test it. And I want to just give a brief tease here that we've got boxes coming out that have much larger and much more complicated looking active regions to test. So, and these will be large enough to do 15-degree ring diagram analyses with, for example. So stay tuned for that. But what we're doing here is we're just testing the calibrated flow method. And so we have these artificial data. We know what the flows are that are present in them. We can measure them directly from the simulation. So it's really just a question of comparing what we get out of the analysis with what we expect. And on the left is sort of the quiet sun or convective flows that I measured from that box, and it's hard to probably distinguish between the red and the blue arrows. The red, which is showing the true flows, and the blue are the measured ones. It's hard to see that there's any real difference there, and there's a little bit of difference, but not much. I will say that one of the things you have to do is we have the flow is known to incredibly high resolution, and you generally want to smear it to something that what you think your analysis is really looking at, and that procedure was done. In the case of the sunspot there in the middle panel, we see the outflows, we see the mode flows, but they differ a little bit from what is actually there. So there are some weird sort of systematics going on in sunspots. Surprise, surprise. So what's shown on the third panel here is basically we look at the flows in polar coordinate system centered on the spot, and we're looking at basically the radial component, so the flow component that's pointed away from the center here in the horizontal direction, and averaged over the azimuthal angle all the way around the spot. And so the red again shows you what mote flow is actually present at the surface. We sampled the flows at the surface at the depths according to the sensitivity function of these measurements, I should add. And the blue shows what we actually get. So yes, we see an outflow, but we see that inside the spot, so these vertical dotted lines represent the umbra and then the penumbra. So inside, right around sort of the umbra-penumbra boundary, the measured flows exceed the expected ones by almost a factor of 2. When you get outside the spot, it sort of switches sign. The measured flows underestimate the true flows by maybe 30% or so. I'll be, be honest with you. At one point I was thinking that's kind of bad, but it's not too bad. Wow, we're actually getting, the sign right. Based on work we've done previously with trying to measure thermal perturbations in sunspots, this is actually kind of not so bad. But I decided to look further at it, and if we could see the next slide. This is sort of going back to the actual original measurements, the travel time measurements now, and in this case it's an east-west measurement. So what you have in panel B there, so the first panel shows the nice sunspot. Panel B shows the actual east-west measurement that I make for this simulation. We can use sensitivity functions and the known flows in the simulation to predict what the travel time should look like according to that sensitivity function. And this was a sensitivity function that Aaron Birch computed. As he said, he worked with us for many years and looking at Matthias's data and coming up with sensitivity functions appropriate for those data. Very nice. So you can predict what you should see, and then you can just look at the difference, just subtract that prediction from the measurement, and you have this residual. And again, this is like, okay, the fact that there is something there means, all right, there's a problem. But again, it's sort of, not too bad. Count your blessings here, I think. The point being, you have a very large artifact inside the spot itself. This is that kind of the very large blue blob on the right and red on the left on panel D there. And then just outside the spot and extending not much more than maybe another sort of sunspot radius or so, you have this weaker artifact or set of artifacts that sort of switches sign. It turns out if you look at how the measurements are made, and we use these quadrants, we call it a pupil in holography, but it's basically the same kind of thing. If we look at where the pixels of those quadrants fall when we start to see these artifacts, it seems to be that the center artifact appears when you have the umbra of the sunspot sort of fitting nicely into one of these quadrants. And you sort of see the secondary weaker artifact when the penumbra becomes a prominent component of the quadrant. So there's the potential for some interesting physics to figure out here. So what's going on? The reason why we expect artifacts like, excuse me, the reason we we're not surprised to see artifacts like this is that, you know, these kernels are constructed, for example, under various assumptions like the Braun approximation. Well, it just happens that a sunspot is not a very small perturbation to the quiet sun in a way that can be handled successfully under the Braun approximation. So it's sort of not surprising that we have artifacts. What may be a nice surprise is that for flows, it may not be so terrible. And perhaps that has something to do with whatever it is that's scrambling up the signal in sunspots is doing it kind of the same way for waves going in opposite direction, and so that you take the difference and it cancels out. I don't know, but certainly there's something there, and even as small as these artifacts appear to be, nevertheless, I was concerned enough about it to do a whole bunch of masking tests to see, are these artifacts contributing anything at all to those flow maps, and if so, where does that contamination happen, and how bad is it? Again, I think, you know, spending time to do control works is always a very good investment. So if we see the next slide, we can see the results of some of those tests. So really, what we see here is we're back to so this is just the meridional component of one of those average flow maps here, shown in grayscale. So you can see the big blobs due to sunspots, but you also, if you look kind of you know, look at where this the white dotted line, and then on the left, or on the rightmost panel shows sort of a slice down that line. And so we see this large inflow signal. You know, you see it sort of peak on the left here at y-5, and it peaks on the right at about 5 degrees. And so that's the kind of signal I was worried about would go away if it was found, you know, due to some contamination issue. So what I did was to just make a bunch of masks and just do not include in the averages any pixels with above various various flux thresholds or flux density thresholds. And so in the middle, I mask out 200 Gauss pixels and above, and that's enough to take out, for example, the large perturbation you see inside the sunspot. So that mask would eliminate all sunspots and a few other things. And really, it obviously the signals inside the active region itself change quite a bit as you throw those points away. But the more extended flows that I'm primarily interested here are not changed. And that's true even if we use very aggressive thresholds, like down to 50 Gauss, pretty much it's almost reaching the noise level of the instrument here, to throw those away. We still, you know, what happens is the signal gets very noisy, and again, where the sunspots are, there's very few pixels contributing there. But again, the more extended flows are not really very sensitive to those pixels. So, okay, I think that if we go to the next slide, it might be summary, I think, yes. Okay, so to summarize, we have inflows are very ubiquitous. The speeds modestly range from about 10 to 20 or 30 meters per second, even though the median flux varies by a factor of 50. The extent of the flux of the flows appear to be around 12 degrees. This seems to be very similar for all regions. I think I maybe didn't mention this third bullet before in talking about the flows, but the inflows tend to be a little bit greater towards the trailing polarity than the leading one. And I think this was a result that Luptin also saw in the correlation tracking results. And finally, no detectable inflows below my cutoff value there. The retrograde flows appear to be a new thing. They seem to be, at least the numbers, 10 to 20 meters per second, appearing primarily on one side. This is kind of consistent with that 5 meter per second cyclonic flow that Brad had. At least we're in the sort of similar ballpark, but as I say, they're not symmetric around the active region. And as we just demonstrated, I think that these flows are mostly robust with respect to, at least to these sunspot artifacts beyond 3 degrees. There's a number of ways to go in the future, and some of them I think I mentioned. In spite of the fact that inversions are hard, I actually have been in contact with Jason Jakowitz, who has a nice student who wants to try out some new inversion methods that Jason has been developing. And so I'm making that available to him and his student for these inversions. And I'm very interested to see what the results will be. As I mentioned, I am interested, and I've done some preliminary tests with sort of picking ensembles based on evolutionary stage. And what you can do, for example, is plot the flux as a function of time and see where the active region reaches a peak flux, and then align the flux curves with that peak and use that as kind of your reference period to look at before, during, and after the peak sort of periods. And I've sort of started to do that. Preliminary results seem to show that the flow kind of gets stronger over time. So there's some encouraging results there, but not I'm still working on getting more samples. Right now the results are kind of noisy, and finding enough samples that I can identify a clearer peak flux is becoming a challenge, but one I think I can overcome. And then finally, I do want to look much further into this issue about how individual active regions are contributing to these global measurements, particularly these residuals that may play important role in various kinds of modeling efforts to do. So with that, I want to thank everyone who's helped out. Like I said, Aaron has provided a number of important kernels to this problem and a lot of advice over the years. Matthias has provided his wonderful simulations. Charles Bollner was nice enough to set up a tracking program to generate the cubes for me from the JSOC that I greatly appreciate. So with that, I'm happy to take questions or comments. Thank you.